just like to say thanks to Jeff Henderson, because that's why I'm here, and you've been leading on the Guildhall. Jeff and I actually went to the same marine engineering course in the 1970s. Jeff took that course, I didn't. I didn't go for the traditional sort of apprenticeship or anything like that. What I did was, I got a job in a photographic lab for 4 years, and I worked there, and it really gave me a fantastic basis in the technical side, but not the aesthetics. So I've been thinking, well, tradition has had a lot of impact on my life, but what is modernity? So I spoke to friends of mine who are academics, historians, and they reckon modernity started in Shakespeare's time, just as we were coming out of the plague. So is that going to happen now as we're coming out of COVID? Are we entering a new age of modernity? Certainly when we came out of the Black Death, we produced Chaucer. So what's going to come out of the post-COVID days? So I would think I'd rather call it modernism. To me, modernism is the 1920s. And certainly with architecture, photography, that's when it all really changed, I think. I was talking to Tina earlier about the Neue Sachlichkeit movement in Germany in the 1920s, where the object was the absolute thing you photographed, nothing else, just that pure object. And that has had a lot of influence on my life. So, how did I get here? Well, I don't know if anybody knows Lindsay Kemp, but he's from my hometown of South Shields. So is Ridley Scott, and so is Eric Idle. And when I was growing up, they were three of my absolute heroes. And I thought, if they got out of South Shields, how do I? Now, this picture is actually only taken in 2016 when I got to know Lindsay. I brought him over from Italy. I thought he'd really been forgotten in this country. And what I like about this is, it's actually on the street where he grew up, on Talbot Road in South Shields. And he's skinning up a spliff. And I just love that picture, you know. And what I also love is the bit of graffiti that goes onto his eyebrow, because it's a bit like one of his radical bits of makeup that he used to do. So I think, you know, Eric Idle, alternative comedy, Ridley Scott, I mean, groundbreaking filmmaking. Lindsay, radical choreography. So these guys, I thought, if they can do it, I can. So how did I do it? Does anybody know these two characters? So actually, Rick Miller's got a big connection with around here. He grew up in Redditch, as did Eric Idle. So there we have another connection. So when I was working in the photographic lab, I was getting paid, I think, £30 a week, and I was working my arse off. Honestly, it was like, but I learnt a lot. So the young ones actually came to Sunderland Empire and did a gig, and I went along, and I only had 6 frames on my film. I just had no money. So every one of those frames had to matter. And I was right in the front row. I got some great pictures of the young ones live. 6 months later, Rick Mill came to Newcastle to do a gig, and I crashed his sound check. I went in there and I said, I've got some pictures. Any chance of photographing you tonight? He gave me a can of brown ale and said, move to London. So it was his fault I left Newcastle. Not only that, but he got my first photograph published ever in a magazine. He arranged it. And I got £25 for that. So I was thinking, hang on, 30 quid a week for working in a lab for 40 hours, £25 for having a fantastic afternoon with this amazing guy. And I started to think, how am I going to make this work? A few months later, Nigel Planer turned up and he did a gig, and he arranged my first book cover. So those two really started my career. And then instead of running away with the circus, I moved down south and I lived at a residential recording studio. Actually, I should talk about this one first. So in parallel with my practice of photographing, bands and alternative comedians, I also had a documentary practice. And I took this when I was 18 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. This girl just turned round, and I just loved the juxtaposition of, the semi-naked sort of things from Woolworths or wherever they are, and her. So this is a stylistic choice, you see. I could have shot it on colour film, but I shot it on black and white, and then I hand-coloured it. So I guess that is embracing tradition when I didn't need to. I could have just shot it in colour. But I think it has more impact when it's a black and white image and you're making these elements stand out by hand-colouring them. So I think we can get onto the residential recording studio next, I think, can't we? So this is a process called reticulation. So what you do is you take a standard black and white film, you develop it in the same kind of way as you would normally, but then you shock it with cold water. And what happens is the grain breaks up into little lines. So suddenly I was thrown into this world where I was working with art directors, so I was doing record sleeves. And this was just the lighting rig projected through a window on the farmhouse where we were living. So we were living in this farmhouse in the middle of Suffolk. So it was so different to Newcastle. And it was a massive learning curve, And I think if we go on to the next one, that's another record sleeve, yes. So using kind of slide projection and things like that. And I just wanted to see if this actually works on my face. Does that reproject onto me? Yeah? So this was the solo album of Glenn Beggar. So what we were doing was the middle is the recording console, which was in a barn. That is just outside, and that is the farmhouse where we're living. And I'm sorry to say, after these pictures were taken, Glenn took his own life. He brought out his first solo album. It didn't do well, and what an awful story. And that is one of the reasons I do not put work online. I don't want this being part of an AI. I've got no control over how that image is being used, especially because it's so poignant. So yeah, very little of my work goes online. I don't want anybody using it without my permission. Now, if anybody can guess what that was for, I'll be impressed. So this was using different types of objects to pour water. So that is actually a developing dish on the left and a jug there. So what was I trying to do here? This was a commission from a dance company, and what we were trying to do was recreate what the dancers were doing on stage with water. So it was quite a challenge, and you can imagine the studio was just absolutely soaked. We had bin liners everywhere, dustbins full of water, and actually my long-suffering assistant is here from the 1990s, Chris, who grew up in Walsall, so he's come all the way from the Isle of Wight today. So Chris, thank you so much for coming home. And we used to be up until 4 o'clock in the morning trying to get these things right. The thing is, you would shoot a Polaroid and you think, oh, that's great, but then to get it on film, how do you do that? You might have lost the best picture on Polaroid. So it was just striving and striving. And then when you get the film back, sometimes it was terrible, other times it was a fantastic surprise. And I miss that kind of alchemy with digital. The problem with digital with me is you shoot away and you shoot away, and then you think, oh, my card's getting full. Not that it is now, because I've got this fantastic new one. But you get rid of images, don't you, to save memory. And what I love about a contact sheet is you go back years later, and a picture that might not have had any meaning, suddenly you think, oh my God, that has real poignancy now. What if that had been wiped off the memory card? It would have disappeared forever. So the contact sheet, to me, is an important thing to look at years later as well as when you've just done the shoot. Now, I have a confession to make, and this is the first time I've ever said this in public, as I am color deficient. I get my browns and my greens mixed up. So how did I make it as a photographer? I mean, that just seems impossible, doesn't it? But I'm not bothered about saying it in public now because I don't do commercial work. The other element to this is it's out of focus. And look at my glasses. I've got really short sight. So what I did was I brought two elements of what you could say my personal challenges were together. I couldn't see color unless it was really bright. It had to be bright. Now, this is actually for early touchscreen technology for the research branch of BT. So we did loads of these. It was a whole week shoot. And then we dropped lots of other little things in there. So of course, that's a handshake. It's the cliche, isn't it? People doing business together. Now, what happens if you turn that around? It becomes something completely different, doesn't it? So this was used on a book cover of the fantastic title of Facing Death and Finding Hope. So this is about helping somebody now. It's not about a business arrangement. So does that dilute the original image? Is this one stronger? Does it have more meaning? I think it does. What happened, you see, was I did the shoot for BT, and then they wanted to get all the copyright off me, and I said, no, I'm not doing that. No way, these are my pictures. If you want the copyright to begin with, you tell me at the beginning, not after the shoot. So this went into something called a stock library, which has completely changed the whole landscape of photography. This is a quote from Mark Getty, who I worked with quite closely in the early 90s. So most of you probably know that his grandfather made a huge amount of money from oil, but was so mean he had a payphone in his house. So if people went there to stay, they had to put their own money in to use the phone. Now here Mark is saying intellectual property is the oil of the 21st century. This was said in about 1993. I think that's pretty true then, but has it changed? Yes, I think it has. Data is now what people are after, aren't they? Your data, anybody's data. Let's use it. Now, this is also a Polaroid. I was talking about Polaroids earlier. They were absolutely essential in terms of finding what the composition was, the lighting, everything like that. It was a tool. And now it's become a luxury item. It's so expensive to buy, isn't it? So this is actually taken without a lens on the camera. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using the light that's coming in through the bellows of a large format camera. And that was trying to sort of illustrate the idea of scanning in a conceptual way. So I did a lot of work for big digital companies, computer companies and things like that. And it was also always a challenge trying to picture what they were doing, because it's so ethereal, isn't it, what goes on a computer. Now, talking about data, this is a project I've been involved with in London. It's called Knitting the Air. And what Caroline, she came up with this fantastic idea of capturing pollution data from the A12 Blackwall Tunnel approach road. This data is then knitted into squares. So the darker the color, the more pollution there is on the road. She's got 120 people involved on this estate, all knitting this data into squares. Absolutely phenomenal. And there she is getting stressed out at the first show that I helped her put on. But I think it's a brilliant way of engaging the community. It's not necessarily photography, but it's certainly visual art. Now, what's this? So this is the very first of the silver Apple laptops. And it was a bit of a challenge to what you normally see on magazine covers, which is scantily clad women, isn't it? So here we have a man. So we rented out these Learjets for a day and did a lot of photography. And I was a bit worried about, what the owners of the aeroplanes might say. And then it turned out it was Jacqueline Gold who runs the Ann Summers shop, so she didn't bat an eyelid. And this was February. He was freezing. Good on him, Charlie. He did a great job. Now let's have a look at the next slide, which shows you how it was used. So it was a bit sort of tantalizing putting that across there. And you might think, why do I want to work for a magazine that's all about computers? But this is in the days when Apple computers went wrong all the time. What was the readership? Art directors. So your work in there would get you loads of work because people would see what you were doing. The problem is if you do an advert, you never get a credit, or very rarely. Editorial, you'll get a credit. So I got a fantastic amount of work by having my work in that magazine. It's a showcase, yeah. So it's sometimes worth thinking laterally about how you can get your name out there, how you can get recognized, Now this is me playing around with neon. So I'm sort of, dipping my toe into the fine art world here. And I was thinking about sort of alternative musical scores, how they could be represented in images. I was also thinking about flags of imaginary nations. I started to think outside the box. But that all comes from the collaboration with art directors. That was the beginning of my teamwork. Sometimes you'd have 15 people in the studio, as we were saying earlier, it's a team effort a lot of times, isn't it? So by having that in my portfolio, I then got the next commission. So this was for cable and wireless. So what we did here was I had, I think, 3 or 4 assistants all dressed in black. And these were LEDs on record turntables and then on dollies. So we were creating these alternative sort of scores. This is Waterloo Bridge. We did about 3 or 4 of them, I think. And then we did another campaign. And this was about 2007. And after that, just about every telecoms company did the same idea. So that's the problem when you get your work out there. People start ripping it off. But it's a compliment in a way, I suppose, isn't it? Now, any idea what this is, anyone? It was never actually produced. This is a concept. This was going to be a camera. So this is back in 1993 for an agency called Studio X. And I found out later that Johnny Ive, I don't know if any of you know who that is, he was the chief designer of Apple Computers. He completely turned that company around in the 1990s. This image was on his wall for 10 years. And I'm just wondering, did that inspire him at all? What he did I have a part in that? I'll never know. Although he did take me out for dinner in San Francisco, and he turned out to be rather a serious guy, actually, because I knew that he'd worked in this company for a design agency called Tangerine. Then he goes to Apple, so I sort of joked, if you ever come back to the UK, you could work for Orange or BlackBerry. He didn't find that very funny at all. Okay, this is the first digital shoot I ever did. Strangely enough, using a traditional Hasselblad camera, but with a high-end digital bag on. And also, I was talking to Andy when we met in London about strobe equipment, how good that lighting is. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the big old packs. And I think the great thing about that was it wasn't a stretched softbox, it was a piece of Perspex. So I think that makes the shots sharper. It makes the images sharper. So these are all Sony products. So I must have done about 3,000 pictures. But you see, I was already losing control over the image because these were put together by an illustrator afterwards. All I was doing was the elements of that. And okay, they went on billboards and things like that. But it was an ill-fated idea from Sony to do something like iTunes. It was called Sony Connect. Never worked. So sometimes you get involved with these things and nobody knows about it, That's the way it goes, I guess. So this was actually for an agency in Birmingham called First Light. So it's part of the UK Film Council. What they did was they gave out money to kids as young as 5 up to the age of 15 to make films. So again, working with an art director very closely, what we did was we looked at the iconography you get on a video control on a camera, So we thought that gave way a line. It looks like fast forward, doesn't it? It was a gift. So these were actually shot in Sheffield and London, where we both lived and worked. And it also matched the text that was in the annual report as well. So, we're doing 3 things here. We're matching the picture, we're matching the text, and we're also linking it to video iconography as well. And I think we've got another 2 of those, haven't we? Yeah. So there you go with those of that. And that won a big award in LA. I was very happy about that. So I've had very little recognition in this country, but in the States, they seem to like my work more. And I don't know whether it's the Association of Photographers or so nepotistic, I've heard that from quite a few people. It seems to be more democratic in America. And I've won awards in LA and New York, not just LA. Okay, now, who are these two geezers, eh? So this was something I did in the late 80s, which I wouldn't say that's anything like the kind of work I normally do. But I did it because it was for a charity. So in the morning, I photographed Andrew at Buckingham Palace, and he was just like that Hugh Laurie character of Blackadder. Absolutely thick as mince, man. Unbelievably stupid. So I walked down, I didn't even get my bag searched when I went into Buckingham Palace. I was just like, I could have had an Uzi submachine gun in there. And I was walking down these corridors full of deer's heads saying, shot by Andy, shot by Fergie. It seemed to go on forever. The carpets were very warm, and I was shown into his sort of private quarters. And he had one of those animal skin rugs with the head still attached. So it was really tasteless. But also on the side, he had a pregnancy testing kit. And I was thinking, if I was paparazzi, I could have blown that story straight out of the water. But I don't do that kind of work. I respect people's privacy, whoever they are. I don't mind. And in the afternoon, hang on, jumping ahead there. Peter Carrington, who at the time was chair of Christie's, I thought, well, he's got a fantastic collection of modernist sculpture we're going to get on. Probably the most short-tempered little man I've ever met in my life. He hated having me taking the pictures, Couldn't wait to see the end of me. And a lot of what I'm showing today, it sort of goes around in a circle. So I'm going to show some work we actually installed in Christie's later on. So I quite like it when sort of things go around in a circle and you're back in the same place or you're doing something unexpected, but it links to your past. And then we go on to the next one. So some people might remember the Independent newspaper back in the 80s. They had this trend for actually coming back from the set and showing how everything was set up like that. A little bit like what Rachel was showing with, how the lights are set up and everything. But this was, I was tacked on to the end of a video shoot, so, quite often stills photographers are not valued at all. It's just like, oh, do we have to have stills at the end, So I didn't like doing that kind of work, so I didn't really sort of pursue that kind of thing. Now, this is me going back to the Northeast. I'd been away for almost 35 years, and I left because there wasn't any work there. But then this Arts Council initiative called Cultural Spring came up, and I'd already put some ideas into the Arts Council because the council estate where I grew up, all of the streets were named after famous writers. So I grew up on Ruskin Crescent. I didn't know who Ruskin was until I was much older. I didn't realize his importance in visual arts. So to go back there and then ask people actually who I grew up with to select a piece of poetry or writing by one of these writers and then have their own quote on the bottom was an amazing thing. And I've been trying to get this money out of Arts Council, maybe £10,000, just to get it going, and I got rejected 3 times. And before I knew it, a big conglomerate of different galleries and universities, they got £2 million based on my idea, Exactly the same idea. And I could have been really awkward and taken them to court and things like that. But I wanted this to happen. And I ended up getting quite a lot of commissions out of them. So I just didn't like the underhand way that was done. And these are the back garages. So I don't know if you get that around here, where you have a council estate and then everyone puts the garage around, the car in a garage around the corner. And I did something incredibly naughty when I was younger with John's brother, who was a good friend of mine. We pooled our chemistry kits and made a bomb out of the potassium and blew one of those doors off. God knows what we were doing. Now, we're getting more into the serious stuff here. This really is tradition and modern. So here we are. This is a glass plate negative, and we're using an iPhone, and it's got all the information you need. So it's not just like a darkroom timer. It's telling you everything you need about this, So that is really using tradition and the modern side by side. Very good example of that, I think. So this is at my studio at Trinity Buoy Wharf, which is on the Thames. It's where the River Lee meets the Thames, opposite the O2. And I've been working with them a long time. And it's almost like the perfect circular economy. So your rent and the rent of the corporate people who are there all goes into a big pot. And then 25% of that goes out as grants. And they've never said no to me. So I asked them for a bit of money. Then that leverages further money out the Heritage Fund or other people. So it's a really, really good model. And I've been there on and off for the last 15 or 16 years. So this is showing the process of wet collodion. I don't know if many people are familiar with that. In fact, I can pass one round. You can have a look. So this is a tin plate, shot in 10.8. So you can actually put it on aluminium. Of course, you can't print through that, can you? Or you can put it on glass. And of course, the image is reversed. So a lot of my cameras I was using in the 90s, you see, for advertising, I've repurposed them for this. So this is the 10-8 camera I would use in the mid-90s. And I think we can put the film on now and sound.
Seeing something happen that you've created, like going through the process step by step and making something from scratch.
Trying to recreate this old Victorian style of photography.
The whole process is amazing. Seeing the photo being developed before our eyes is just amazing.
Didn't realize how malleable it would be and how soft it is, and I guess alive in a way.
And was just amazed to see glass blowing running here.
We were asked to come to Trinity Buoy Wharf to do some introductory public glassblowing sessions.
The banqueting hall, which is a building in Newcastle, and it was originally commissioned by Armstrong.
It's good that there's kind of like community spaces like this.
I can't think of anything more exciting than Lord Armstrong's hall being used for something really creative.
Okay, my favorite funder, by the way. Love them. So as you can see, there was also glass blowing, and we were harvesting pigments from hydroponically grown plants. So that all links in to this project called Cargos, which is, it's looking at sort of Victorian innovation. And the glass blowing you see is very pertinent to Newcastle, where I'm from, because these glass blowers from Italy came over. And when they were taking coal down to Newcastle, they had no real ballast to put in the ships on the way back, so they were filled with sand. That sand was then thrown overboard in the Tyne, would wash up, and it was used in the glass blowing industry. And then those glass blowers, with those skills, they actually came very close down to Trinity Buoy Wharf to work at the Thames Plate Glassworks. So this book, I wanted it to look like, you know, a book of Victorian poems, you know, so we have the foil blocking there. This was actually bound in Leicester and printed very close to here in Kenilworth. So if you want to have a look at that and pass that round. I just think it's incredibly important to have a publication for a project rather than just something on a website, you know. As I was saying, I don't want the work to be accessed that easily. With a book, it's an object that you can treasure, really. And I think, you know, looking at those traditional ways of bookbinding and making, and even the stitching, you see, there's red and yellow stitching in there, and that represents the colours of Northumberland. So we have thought about this on lots of different levels. Okay, now this is me at college. Can you believe it? So after I studied marine engineering, I then moved to live at the residential studio in Suffolk, and then one of the art directors I was working with, he said, "Have you ever thought about going to art college?" Well, I hadn't. Wasn't really in my sort of remit when I was growing up. You were either a coal miner, or you worked at the shipyard, or you worked in a factory. You didn't go to art college, you know. So this, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Dwayne Michaels, very famous for doing sequences. So these are 6 images, and the reason there's actual sort of, you know, dirt around the edges is because my flat in Brixton burnt down in 1991, and that's the fireman's footprints around here. This is one of the few things that survived. Most of my work was destroyed, you know, so it was start again. So that was quite a thing to go through. But at least you could squat. If you were in a terrible position, you had no house, you could squat in somebody else's house for a few months just to get yourself back on your feet. So here was the only time I got a distinction from the lecturer, because he didn't like me. He just liked things that were black and white and traditional. He hated the modern. And I almost got thrown out of college for calling me a Luddite. You had to go and look it up in a dictionary, which was very funny. So here we are. I'm in the dark room, printing away, and I leave the dark room. And go on the next one. What happens? The image gets off the paper here, look. It hides in the cupboard. And then the next one, the image gets out of the cupboard, puts me on the print, and I'm locked there forever. So that was work I was doing in about 85, 86. So you can see the sort of, I was interested in conceptual ideas, not just straight photography. Okay. So this is the current project I'm working on. This is a Victorian steamship called SS Robin, which was built in 1890, right down at Trinity Buoy Wharf on the River Lee. So it's come home again. You know, it's been working all over the world, in northern Spain, you know. So it's too fragile to go on the water. So this picture on the right is the inside of an absolutely massive pontoon that was built in Poland. So you can see all of those kind of doors around the side. They're all watertight. So when they brought it over from Poland, they filled those outer rooms with water just to make it a safe buoyancy. And these were done about a year ago. So we didn't have any electricity on the ship. So we, in the captain's cabin, all we did was we put red gels over the portholes and we had a dark room. Amazing. So we did all the shots on the ship, and then we exhibited them on the ship, on the pontoon, sorry. And it was the easiest hang I've ever done because it's a steel hull. So all you needed was magnets on the prints. Keep them up there. No framing, no mounting. Easy. Really good. Now this is the wet collodion process. I think that's going around. Now this is very, very sensitive to the blue spectrum. So when you actually look at the hull of the ship, you cannot see this pattern. It's invisible to the human eye. But if you use a blue spectrum form of photography, it comes out. So it's actually been very useful in them restoring the ship because they know where the problems are, you know? So we weren't expecting that. Now, this guy on the right, that is Jude Law's suit from the film Wild with Stephen Fry playing Oscar Wilde. So he bought that off eBay. And then he's accentuated that with the cowboy hat. So I think he looks like something out of the American Civil War, which is when this process was really big, you see. So it's interesting photographing contemporary people within this context. And then Anna Makasinski, who's from Canada, she invented a torch. When she was 15 years old, she invented a torch that works off the body heat of a human, you know, amazing. So not just a pretty face. Okay. Now this is probably shot in the 1860s, I think. And I think these are Crimean war veterans. They're sat around a barrel of beer which says Massam. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Thixton's Brewery or Black Sheep. That's certainly based in Massam. But at the back there, at the top, I mean, there's some writing there. I just can't work out what it is. It looks backwards. So this, to me, is an intriguing shot. It's like, who are they? What were they doing? And actually, for those kind of times, it's quite informal, especially the guy sitting on the barrel. These are some glass plates that were rescued by my dad. So can you believe somebody was smashing these up in the 1980s and just throwing them in the sea? Unbelievable stupidity. So this is the North Tyne Pier, which was destroyed by a big storm, I think, in the 1896. It took them a long time to rebuild it. So they're basically just going right back to the basics. A bit like a root canal filling. They're having to take the lighthouse right down to the sea. And I mean, look what they're working with, you know, hand tools. It's incredible. And then the date is always in the corner, you see. So you'd write that in black ink on the glass plate, and then it would come out as white on the actual print. So I've been showing these pictures alongside the wet collodions that we've been shooting as well. And I just happened to go to the Seafarers mission in South Shields, where I'm hoping to do some work with. I went there a couple of months ago, and this picture was on the wall. So that must have been one of my dad's friends who put it there in the 1980s. It was like, wow, it's great to see it's still there. Still talking about my father, this is the coal mine where he worked. So I think it was just before the strike, I did a lot of pictures there. I went there and photographed all the people who worked there. And then a few years later, I started revisiting these images. And the original picture was just 1/4 of that. But by putting it together, I've created almost something out of Star Wars, haven't I? You know, yeah, amazing. By playing around with archival images can bring up some great surprises. This is what we did at Christie's. So despite Peter Carrington, who was long dead by then, I think, we were invited to do, actually, it was about 6 times this size. So it was a big collage of about 7 or 8 different artists, and it went all the way around the auction rooms. And it was up there for about a week, I think. So this is another picture that I've been revisiting. You might remember the girl from earlier. She's in there. But also this one. I mean, that's something you just don't see anymore, do you? Packs of wild dogs on the street. I used to see it all the time when I was growing up. Where have they all gone? So what we did was we took the 3 of those and we made them into 9. So I was starting to play around with my archive, my documentary work, because I could not see how to make any money out of being a documentary photographer. I could not see a way of doing it, you know? And in some ways, it had already become an academy in the 1980s. You know, there was very little outlet in terms of magazines for it, certainly in this country. So that's why I went sort of more into the sort of entertainment side of it and then advertising. Now, this is the Getty Archive, which is behind Screwfix in Canning Town. You don't know it was there. It's just a big warehouse. And I think that's an 11/16 neg of a waterfall. So I've been working with them, or at least trying to. It's quite difficult. So because of my relationship with Mark Getty from the 90s, I had a bit of an in there. But they are difficult to work with. And they've got 80 million images in there. 80 million. So they can be negs or lantern slides or prints. And they've only digitized 2% of those. So they don't know what they've got. They just got so greedy they bought everything. But I mean, if they haven't got the facility to make it more widely seen, I think that's pretty pointless, isn't it, really, you know? I mean, you walk in there, it's like that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, when it pans back to at the end and they're putting it away and there's just a massive warehouse. It's like, what's in there? I mean, just little cardboard boxes with string around them. Nobody knows what's in those. And they've only got a staff of half a dozen. They're never going to get it done, you know? So I'm trying to open it up a little bit because it's such a corporate entity. They're quite difficult to work with, unfortunately. But we've done a few tours there. I've taken local people around to see it. And they've been very accommodating that way. So some of the work you can't even look at in the strip lights. You've got to go into a darkened room. So they've got a daguerreotype of Disraeli. They've got an original rayograph by Man Ray. I mean, they've got an amazing collection. And they don't know probably 90% of what they got, you know? But what has been more successful is looking at personal archives of families that I've reached out to. So this is a photographer called Mabel Eardley Wilmot. So this is 1912. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the, let me get this right. Omar Khayyam's long-form poem, The Rubaiyat. So this is an illustration of that, shot in the Middle East. So that word in Arabic, I think, Suzanne, you told me, is kismet, which is the same as destiny. So this is actually quite a conceptual representation of a poem. And these are what's called the tip-ins. So even at this stage, you could not print directly into a book. You had to print it separately and then mount it. So that's been very interesting seeing her work. Her son ended up becoming professor of logic at Oxford University. I mean, really interesting family. Mabel Eardley Wilmot, which I'd never heard of her before. Now this is Albert Bowen, who was born in Stafford. It's not too far from here, is it really? So he was the engineer of the Trans-Andean Railroad that went from Argentina to Chile. So these are shot in the early 1900s on a camera called a Kodak Panoram. I didn't realize they had panorama cameras in those days. But this is, I know his granddaughters, and they gave me access to this album of his work, which has never been seen before. And I love this documentation of the railways, but on the next slide, it's even more interesting. They're down here in Tierra del Fuego having a picnic. I mean, it's a fantastic document of how the English were behaving abroad, you know, taking their sort of cultures into other cultures. Now, this is actually my family, believe it or not. So we did once have money, but that is my maternal grandfather there on that side. That's taken about 1905. But believe it or not, he didn't like being rich. He didn't like being in the sort of strict Edwardian sort of society. So he left that world of luxury and became a coal miner. Most people want to go the other way, don't they? Amazing. So on the other side, that is my paternal grandmother. So Irish peasants, what a contrast. But I would say that illustrates traditional and modern pretty well, doesn't it? So the one of my grandmother, who was a bit of a mystic, I remember her when I was younger. That's an incredibly modern-looking photograph, isn't it? It's from 1920, isn't it? You know, and she looks fantastic, doesn't she? Yeah. Whereas these look kind of really stiff and not much fun. Okay. Now this is Andy was talking about bringing empty buildings back to life, and that's something I've really got into since 2008 when we did this. So this is the Middlesex Hospital in central London, which was being demolished, and I thought it was such an important building, it had to be marked in some sort of way. So one of the things we did was we took in former patients and staff, including Professor Sir Anthony Epstein, who co-discovered the ME virus. He was like 86 when he came along, photographed him in the rubble. But what I was interested in doing was having these kind of ephemeral projections of people who had been involved with the hospital before. So Mary Stopes is very well known. She was involved with female health there. 1920s, and over here we have Prince Monolulu. He wasn't really a prince, he was a bookmaker. And apparently he used to walk around Fitzrovia saying, I've got a horse. And this was when gambling on horses was illegal, So what a character. So I thought it was important to mark these people who had such an impact on the area in different kinds of ways. Now this is really sort of illustrating how commissioned work can then sort of inform a fine art installation. So this one on the left was shot for NESTA, which is the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. So that's actually the stairwell of my old studio. And we're using video stills of diaries of people who have been awarded grants. And then on the other side, that is this crumbling chateau in the Ardèche in the south of France. And we showed, I think, 35 artists there. So it's all about learning how to place things, placing modern art in a traditional setting. Now this is looking at, traditional processes. This is using a camera obscura, so no lens at all, just blacking out the whole room, and putting a tiny hole in the window, and then getting the right angle to get there. So you'll recognize that as the post office tower. And it's in focus somewhere in the middle. But this is a big print. That's probably about the size we did it, you see. So we had this method of getting kind of old agricultural drainage pipes, cutting them in half, and then rolling the print up to develop it. You couldn't get a dish big enough for that. So, we had a developer running down our arms, and we were kind of putting it through the developer and then the stop bath and the fix. So that was only done in about 2011, I think. This is getting on to more what we call plant-based imaging. This is by Nettie Edwards, a process she's come up with. She's from this area as well. And this is all about using the natural chemicals that are in the leaves and the flowers and using those to create images after you've put them out in the sun. This is called an anthrotype, I believe. So that's one of the processes you can use. And that's the result. So I did that one in Italy. I put it out in the sun for 2 hours, got this fantastic image. And here in this country, they were out for 6 weeks, I got nothing. Last summer was just useless. Yeah, so you can see that is actually the negative I've used in the top there. And then I've put that on the leaf. Put it out in the sun under a piece of glass, left it there for 2 days. And as soon as the leaf starts to go dry at the edge, you know you've got an image. So it's been a fantastic experiment to be working with all that. Now you can just about see an image coming through there. This is processes that are really around in the 1790s. Elizabeth Fulham, who was a chemist in Edinburgh, would be working with this kind of thing, but she had no way of fixing the images. She would create these images and they would fade. I mean, how frustrating must that have been? Now, this is Megan Ringrose. So I'm deliberately working with female photographers because a lot of them from the 1790s, the 1820s have been forgotten. So I thought it was important to work with, female image makers from now. So Megan's come up with these fantastic recipes. So she gets oak golds, which are these little spheres that grow on the trees, and it's made by a wasp. It's a little wasp nest. And then you crush that down, and you make a light-sensitive emulsion from that. You coat it on the paper, and you make a sort of contact print. You put it out in the sun. And then to develop it, you get sequoia bark. You boil it for about 3 hours, and that's the developer, and it works. It's absolutely incredible. Yeah. And this is a different process. This is by a Dutch artist called Karel Doing. I think that's how you say it. So this is using standard photographic paper in daylight, but developed in vitamin C solution. So that's actually 2 pictures of my parents from the 1950s and some leaves around it and, just experimenting, trying new things, always moving on, trying new things. When photography first came out, all these painters were worried about they were going to lose their livelihoods, and painting was dead. But I've actually sort of revived it really by taking photographs and making them into massive murals. So I shot the dog with a camera, by the way, not a gun. And that composite is probably from 3 or 4 different pictures. So this is 9 stories high. And people say, well, why a chihuahua? It's like, well, it's next to the Isle of Dogs. It's facing Barking. It's the perfect place for it. But really, why we chose a chihuahua is because of the aspirational qualities within a chihuahua. So this area is changing. And what's more aspirational than a chihuahua? Well, if you look down at the bottom of the photograph, it says gentrified tick box. And we loved that. Somebody had come along, local person. Thought that was very funny. And can you see him in the context of Canary Wharf? There he is, bottom right, making a statement. What's great is there's no other street art around there. It stands out. It really does make a statement. Now, these are 2 ladies that worked at Bletchley Park in 1944-45, operating a computer called Colossus. And behind them is a mural of Tommy Flowers. So not many people have heard of him. A lot of people have heard of Alan Turing, but Tommy is just as important. But his work was even more secret. It was a system called Lorenz. So it was basically Hitler's BlackBerry. There was only 10 of those. Enigma machines were common as muck, really. Every tank commander or submarine commander had one. It was used for, a new periscope or some tracks. So the mural is by Jimmy C., who's really famous for doing the one of Bowie in Brixton that became a homage site. So he's really a spray paint pointillist. So again, taking a photograph and making a piece of street art out of it is something I've really been exploring a lot. This one here is apparently the first ultraviolet lit mural. That's actually on my old school. So in 1979, I got canned for doing graffiti. 35 years later, I went back and commissioned that. I thought that was pretty cool. Now, this is a Canadian artist I've worked with quite a lot called Rhodesworth. And what we're representing there is kind of alternative musical notation by somebody called Cornelius Cardew. Now, you've heard of him, yeah. Well, do you know, he was knocked down in mysterious circumstances, and people wonder whether it was the government because he was a bit of a Marxist. Of course he was. Yeah, so this is a homage to Cornelius Cardew. We're painting his notations on a road in London. So thank you, Cornelius. You've done some amazing work. Now, this is my studio. I mean, actually, in the shipping container, which now is a hipster cliche, but when it was built 25 years ago, it wasn't. These were the first people to do it. So this, again, is at my studio. And I'm kind of interested in words as well as photographs, really. So I commissioned a Korean-American artist to come up with these sculptures. She uses Lego for everything. And she's even been using kind of Lego in the form of Braille by using the other side of it, so you can read it. Amazing artist. Getting onto that idea of, text, how many words is a photograph worth now? It's certainly not 1,000, 5 or 6. I mean, there's so many photographs out there. I think I got really disillusioned about 2010 when I read that there'd been more photographs taken in that 1 year than they had in the whole history of photography. And most of it is absolute crap, isn't it? That's the problem. So I started to think about, well, maybe I'll start describing photographs in words. So I went around the world for about 3 months. And every time I stopped somewhere, I just created this sort of imaginary country. But these things that I saw were real. And what I'm doing here is I'm describing photographs that haven't been taken. And then I mounted them up in 2024 frames and, exhibited them as photographs would be. It's quite an interesting experiment. This is where I have my studio. So this is back in the 1860s. The lighthouse is still there. It was used by Michael Faraday for his experiments with lighting. That was then rolled out for the whole Trinity House. Now, what's interesting about this is it's actually based on a photograph, but you couldn't reproduce photographs, even as a tip-in with Mabel's work, until probably 1890, 1900. So what is real in there? And this really makes me think about what would be happening in the Crimean War, the American Civil War. How much of what transposed from the original photograph into the line drawing reproduction was real? Did they take loads of bodies out? Did they put another general in there? A bit like sort of Victorian Photoshop, isn't it? The way things were manipulated, we don't know. Right, and now we have a little film. So getting back to the pontoon, this is a little bit abstract, but it does include a section where photographic paper is being used in a different way, the colorama rolls that you have in studios. So this is on the pontoon. What I've been doing is using the whole vessel and the pontoon as a giant percussive instrument. So we've been recording the people who are working on the restoration with the hammers and things like that. But I've also been working with a South African artist, a writer and a performer called Anna Wolf. And she is a percussionist and a drummer. So we just let her go wild in the pontoon, and this is what's being created, and it will become some new material that she's working on. Yeah. Photographic paper, drum. So as we get ready for the next Q&A, I just wanted to show you a clip from a film made by Daraba Paceno, who's here in the audience. And this is another piece of photorealistic art. We just put it on for a few minutes, I think, yeah. We'll start in about 45 seconds.
Frances Bacon is emerging on D Street.
Yeah.
She ran the Iron Bridge Tavern on East India Dock Road. And on the right is Francis Bacon, the famous British artist, who spent time in the area visiting the Iron Bridge Tavern and other places with his biographer Daniel Farson, who was a local resident.
When I was given the concept to paint Queenie Watts and Francis Bacon in collaboration with Zebu, I was excited by the idea of painting Francis Bacon because he's always been one of my favourite artists, an artist I've always admired. I still admire to this day. So I was really excited about painting him.
So I didn't know about Queenie Watts before Jimmy contacted me for the project and told me, look, there's going to be 2 portraits, one of Francis Bacon, which I knew about, and Queenie Watts. So I had to look her up, look what she was doing.
I had looked through quite a few different images of Francis Bacon, and the one I chose in the end, I liked it because of the expression. I liked the contrast of light and dark in the image, and it was more that kind of expression of confidence, and correlates to his work, which is very confronting.
So this took about a week.
These 2
how it's coming together
new murals.
Somewhere to find interesting visual images like this.
Beautiful bit of photo.
And now what I really enjoy is that they're here in my neighbourhood. I can walk around the street and see these kind of aesthetically pleasing images, which have also kind of got a certain utility to them. There's a narrative there that you can read into the images, like who were these people? And it's a great reminder of the past, because I get a bit upset sometimes that so much that was familiar to me is no longer here. And this image is kind of fantastic. I love it. Can we have some more?
Yes. So we're hoping to do another 2 this year, actually, because there's another 2 gable ends there. And it brightens up the area, doesn't it? Francis Bacon used to go there to pick up very good-looking Cockney men, you see. He's known for Soho. But his 2 main sort of lovers, Joan Edwards and George Dyer, are from that area. And Queenie Watts would run one of these kind of entertainment pubs that he would frequent with his biographer, Daniel Farson. But what we weren't expecting was people to walk past and saying, is she wearing a hijab? I mean, my mother and my grandmother used to wear headscarves, but now they don't. Caucasian women don't. So it brought up so many interesting conversations in that area, which is 70% Bangladeshi now. And it's gone down incredibly well. Yeah. Okay, I can't believe 45 minutes has gone already. That was 45 years.
Garry, just before you finish, could you just... The one thing I'd love you to have touched on is the Tommy Flowers pub.
Yes.
Can you just give it a quick mention?
Let's go back to the beginning there, yeah, because that's the street, yeah.
Yeah? Just very quickly, just because I think that is such an important...
Turn the volume down.
This is Aberfeldy Street.
So this is the pub on the corner here, you see, where Nick's coming out. And that's an old GP practice, you see, which we turned into a community pub. But really, it was an art project disguised as a pub. And you get all these kind of geezers coming in going, oh, you're not tuning into that art shit, are you? It's like, no, not at all. So we introduced it very, very slowly, you see, and it's still going. And the whole street has now been painted up. So a lot of these are to do with traditional Bangladeshi textiles. And it's like the most colourful street in London, really, and it's all being knocked down at the end of the year. So once the pub was established, I passed it on to local people to run, and then I took over the post office. We used that as the artist development space. Right. So a lot of people have gone through there and they've had their work shown at Venice Biennale, places like that. So it's great to have that facility, which we've never been charged rent on, so we don't charge the artists, you see.
Okay.
So it works for everybody.
If anyone here from the council can just tell me.
It's a housing association, but they've been very good to us. Yeah.
Right.
And thank you, Suzanne, for the visuals.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
good.
you, everyone. Thank you.